Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show brought to you by the GoldSilverBitcoin.com store. We are more than honored to be sitting down today with Robert Kientz. He's the founder of Gold Silver Pros. Thank you so much, Robert, for sitting down with us today.
Thank you, Justin, for having me.
So I saw you give a speech at Stock Pulse's Silver Symposium, and you were talking about Texas becoming a financial powerhouse, more specifically on the gold front. Can you tell people what you were thinking during that research and that speech?
Yeah, so as many people who follow the gold and silver industry may know, Texas has established its own gold bullion depository. You can put both gold and silver. And it's, as I was doing research into this, not from a perspective of a potential customer, just the reasoning why they did it. I ran across the comptroller website here in the state of Texas, and I found some very interesting things, which led me down a deeper rabbit hole in terms of how Texas may be becoming more of a financial powerhouse, not only gold and silver, but beyond that. And what the comptroller was reporting was their original design when they set up this bullion depository was actually to be a competitor for the depositories in the state of New York and in back east. So they wanted it to actually compete for business, and not only business in the physical precious metals, but in the commodities markets and the derivative markets. So Texas had been thinking about, how do we get involved in participating in commodities trade? And those that follow the commodities trade in the states know that we have, the big, I guess the four big markets in Chicago and New York and in that area. And those are the traditional trading hubs. Why Texas is all of a sudden interested not only in having a physical bullion storage facility, but also getting involved in the commodity derivative market, I find completely interesting. And I haven't found any reason why, other than Texas felt like they wanted to challenge the status quo. Perhaps this is Texas saying, hey, we're tired of all of these markets being determined in one location. Maybe they want more democracy, because we've certainly in our program talked about the issues with those markets. But I just found the whole thing interesting, and that led me to discover that the governor of Texas, Abbott, I've been talking with NASDAQ and some of the other exchanges for actually bringing the financial exchanges down to Texas, which really stunned me. So all of a sudden, Texas, is getting involved on the financial end of things after staying out of it pretty much for its entire history. And I just find that very interesting.
The Texas Bullion Depository. Can you tell people who don't know what that is?
So essentially, if you want to buy and store precious metals, not at your home, but somewhere else that's safe, that's protected in a world-class facility, that comes with basically the blessing of a state government, it's run by a state government, so it's legitimate, it's there for the people to use. That's what the Texas State Bullion Depository is. Now, we haven't really done things like this. Really, we haven't even considered doing this since 1933, when gold was confiscated through executive order, which I think is unconstitutional. But in any case, a lot of people gave up their gold in 1933, and then since 1933, people really haven't owned very much gold on a personal level in the United States, except for collectors and the odd precious metals person like myself. About 1% of all assets owned in the U.S. is bullion or gold and silver in whatever format. And so 99.5% is other. So because it was confiscated, gold we were taken off the gold standard in 1971, so it was no longer official state money. People just haven't had this interest in collecting the bullion, widespread at least, and thinking of gold as, a primary asset to store your wealth. So along comes the Texas State Bullion Depository, and you have to question the timing. This came around, I think, in 2018, and you have to question the timing. Why in 2018 was the state of Texas a large sovereign entity within the United States with its own constitution? Why is all of a sudden are they bringing gold back into the conversation? I mean, Texas is a huge state. I think it's something over 20 million people, 22, 23 million people. Why all of a sudden are we talking about gold and silver bullion in a government sponsored depository? And then following that, why are we talking about trading derivatives in the stock markets? Is Texas wanting its independence? Is it just tired of the grip that the entities have had on some of the financial markets? I don't know. I mean, they're very interesting questions.
On the comptroller website, the Texas comptroller website, it reads, Quote, in summer 2018, Texas began operating the nation's only state-run Boolean Depository, a highly secure government-backed storage facility comparable to the U.S. Bullion Depository in Fort Knox, Kentucky, which holds federal gold reserves. Now the Texas Bullion Depository, which experienced a surge of deposits during the earlier phases of the global coronavirus pandemic, aims to provide its services to a wider range of clientele and make lasting impacts that extend well beyond the Texas border. The article concludes, quote, with TXBD in operation, a push is building in Texas for commodities trading options outside of New York. According to State Representative Giovanni Capriglione, the author of the bill that created TXBD Eternal, wrote that Texas is ideally positioned both geographically and economically to become an epicenter for commodities trading. So I don't think that's from the comptroller website, that second part, but there is another article of somebody who is talking about State Representative Giovanni Capriglione's statements. Can you speak more to perhaps the situation in Texas generally, especially post-COVID, and why there might be a flight of gold to Texas, as well as why Texas might ideally be positioned geographically and economically?
So Texas has always been, and a lot of people may not know this if you've never been to Texas, it's always been an easy place to fly in and out of. So it's got a huge business base, especially in Dallas-Fort Worth. Dallas-Fort Worth and Houston both have these massive international airports. And between Dallas-Fort Worth and Houston Airport, you can go nonstop almost anywhere in the world. Major airlines, all the major airlines fly out of there. Dallas-Fort Worth is American Airlines' major hub. Houston Intercontinental, you got several airlines as well. Dallas also has Love Field, which has Southwest Airlines. So, you can go just about anywhere. It's a huge business base in the Dallas-Fort Worth and Houston areas. The governors have always been business friendly. We have a wide range of different industries down here. It's not just oil and gas. We have a lot of technology, with a lot of financial services, and many others. So Texas, into and of itself, is very independent in terms of its ability to, one, produce income, two, have energy independence, and three, have a positive business climate and positive job growth, even when the rest of the nation is not. So inflation in Texas has always been a little bit lower. Property prices have always been more affordable, but holding steady. We don't bubble up in property prices as often as other places that you'll see. So it's been a great place for people to come and raise families as well. It is centrally located. So, you can go from Texas just about anywhere in the US in about 2.5 to 3 hours on a flight. And, we have access to South America, Central America, and Mexico, major hubs for trading and where we get a lot of our goods and services. Plus, Texas also has a great growing season and grow a lot of our own food. So there's major agricultural and produce that's grown in the state of Texas as well, much like there is in Florida and California. So yeah, Texas has always been a great place to live. From the perspective of a bullion depository, it makes sense if you consider Texas's history. We were an independent nation at one point that we decided that we wanted to be part of the Union and join it, but we had won our independence from Spain and Mexico. So, Texas has a proud history of being independent. So if anybody was going to step up and say, hey, we want our own bullion depository, sure, I definitely understand that. I just find the timing odd, Justin. Why in 2018 is all of a sudden Texas saying we want to have a bullion depository? And in that comptroller website, it basically stated that they wanted a place for people to store bullion, but they also wanted to facilitate bullion trade, not only to the state of Texas, but the rest of the world. So it's like Texas is announcing all of a sudden, hey, we're independent from the United States in terms of, trading the markets. And Texas really took a big step forward in that. And typically that's been, bequeathed, like I said, back east in the financial centers. So it's not only the state representative. If you think about how bills eventually reach Congress, the state representatives are representatives of the people. So there are people that wanted this to happen. Okay. Much like there's a secession movement in the state of Texas, there are people that wanted financial and business independence. And I think that is a statement more about the relationship of Texas with the United States federal government and how the Texas people feel about maybe what's going on politically in the United States as well.
I think we've seen a migration in the United States from coastal states to middle American states such as Texas and others. And we've also seen over the last 5 to 10 years, maybe, some bills be put forth in varying states that either say the state can hold gold and silver, or otherwise make it legal tender. I think even if not legal tender, pay that taxes are payable in gold and silver. I think if I'm recalling out of Oklahoma, there was a bill like that not too long ago. In Idaho, also, Senator, I think, Ron Nate, he proposed a bill to make it so that Idaho's treasurer could buy gold and silver, or particularly gold, to hold gold. So, I mean, it's interesting with the US system, the way it's set up, the states are able to have a certain degree of autonomy. They are able to put forth certain types of bills, such as these gold and silver friendly bills that we see in some of these states, and then also potentially make the actions that you claim Texas is making. Can you maybe speak to this trend towards gold in certain states in the United States, why that might be a smart reason? And then furthermore, I guess Texas, you keep saying that you're surprised that this happened in 2018. Obviously, so much has happened since 2018, particularly since 2020.
Yes.
And I wonder if why it's important that that there would be competition to New York and the COMEX. But so starting with this move generally at the state level towards gold and silver that we've seen in certain states, what are your thoughts on that?
So I'll say the basis for that is actually in the Constitution. So if you look at the Constitution and Bill of Rights, all rights and privileges not explicitly granted to the three branches of federal government reside in the states and in the people of the states. So the states have always had more power than the federal government constitutionally. The federal government, I think, has overreached majorly in their expansion of powers. The Supreme Court has not helped that by quote unquote interpreting the Constitution favorably to the federal government, because they are a part of the federal government. So there's basically a conflict of interest. But in any case, I mean, all the rights should reside in the state and the local municipalities. That's the way it's supposed to be. And the federal government was always supposed to be small and independent. And I think what happened, some light bulbs switched on. Perhaps it was the crisis, the Lehman crisis. Perhaps it was the overreach of federal authorities. What happened during the Trump administration, the really nasty battles we've had politically between, the red team and the blue team, as I call them, the Democrats and Republicans. Perhaps it's just that Texas and some of these other states finally stood up and said, screw this. We recognize that the states should have most of the power in this constitutional federalist system, and the federal government is overreached. And monetarily, what's happened is the federal government has printed so much money and incurred so much debt that it's put the states at risk. The states are now at risk of being insolvent. Plus, the states are dealing with pension crises and other fiscal crises, that I think that the states realize that we're going to have to get back to some sort of sound money system or alternative money system. So some of the other states you mentioned, there are a lot of states that have proposed bills, maybe not even passed, to end taxes on bullion, because bullion's money and you don't tax money. Like when you go to the grocery store and give a 20 over for your milk and eggs, they don't tax you on that transaction because you don't tax money. Well, gold and silver per the Constitution really should be the only money. We shouldn't be dealing with the paper dollar. And I think states are asserting their rights. One of the other states that I mentioned there at Silver Symposium was Tennessee, whose Senate passed a resolution, 32-0, not a law, but a resolution, to examine doing their own bullion depository after Texas had done theirs. 32-0 in the Senate. So I'm not aware that a law has been passed that they're going to establish one, but we could have another one in Tennessee. And it's just interesting over the last 5 to 6 years, and specifically since the Lehman and the mortgage crisis, that situation, that people have started to turn back to gold. And it's not happening just at the individual level, it's happening at the state legislature level. But I think it's also influenced by the overreach of the federal government, their printing of the money, their destruction of the value in savings and the dollar we're seeing now with high inflation. I think states are beginning to say, hey, wait a minute, we need to provide some alternatives for our citizens.
And why is it important for there to be competition for New York in Texas, do you think?
Well, New York basically is a monopoly. If you look at how the COMEX is run, and oh my gosh, if you visit my channel, you'll see 100 videos in the past of me railing on the problems with the COMEX. First of all, as a former auditor, I worked in Ernst & Young, KPMG, and for Verizon. I worked for Fortune 13 companies and in the Big Four as an auditor. That's where I was trained. Did that for about 12 years out of my 25-year career. And you learn as an auditor that there a lot of times is a lot of complexity, unnecessary complexity, and lack of transparency. And when I look at the COMEX and other derivative markets, there's a complete lack of transparency. Part of it is because when the federal government passed the Commodities Exchange Act and the subsequent act that created the CFTC, which is the regulator, they didn't give them a lot of power. So the regulator basically is limp in that they don't have the ability to really regulate those markets. And what that's created is the ability of these big players to go in and basically run the markets. And not only do the players you run the markets to have the data so they can trade against, their clients' books, and they do it all. You can see it in the data. They do it all the time. The audit reports that come out specifically for gold and silver and the reserves are not very clear, and you can't tell that gold and silver is not owned 100 times over because the audits are really shoddy. And the working group within this whole regulatory scheme that facilitates and monitors those audit reports really does a poor job, in my opinion, according to industry standards. So you have issues with figuring out how much metal is there for precious metals. You have these big bullion banks which run the show and do all this naked shorting of the metal. Naked shorting defined as they drop more short paper on the market than they have physical precious metals in their own possession to back it up. That's the definition of a naked short. So if you look at what's traded on the COMEX, most of it's naked short. And that's price manipulative. And we know that. Research in past commodities markets dating back to late 1800s shows that naked shorting is manipulative. It manipulates prices to the downside and allows big players who have all the data and know what those prices are going to be the next day, trade and profit off of that. So what has happened was we saw when oil went to 140 bucks, that was speculative trading. That wasn't a worldwide massive shortage. There were some shortages, but it was speculative trading. Okay, that damaged a lot of people, put a lot of truck drivers out of business because you saw gas at diesel gas at $6 a gallon here in Texas for the first time in ever. And Texas is a very low gas price state because we have refineries here. So you saw a lot of economic inequalities in the last 10 years. And you see these financial entities get slaps on the wrist and not go to jail, and they manipulate or they control these markets. And I think it's gotten to the point of people have just gotten tired of it. And really since 2008, 2009, there hasn't, you had Dodd-Frank, but that Dodd-Frank really hasn't reined in the control that the commercial entities have over all our financial markets. Sarbanes-Oxley, after Enron, has helped a little bit with the transparency, but there's so many problems. I know I was a SOX auditor for a long time. It has so many problems. So the federal government has been ineffectual in keeping monopoly power or oligopoly power out of the financial markets. And so that's the incentive for the states then to say, and the people to say, okay, we need a new system. And it's a perfect time to do it because now you can talk about states' rights and people's rights. And maybe it's time for us to have that conversation.
When it comes to the Constitution and money, it does state that there ought to be a bimetallic standard.
Yes.
Can you talk about how we've gotten away from the bimetallic standard? And I guess more to the point, I went to a Bitcoin conference in June 2021, and the energy was palpable. The talk was about central banks. It was about also inflation and debt. And there was that energy, which I stated was palpable, that really kind of gave like an activist bent to the Bitcoin movement. They were creating an alternative of sound money for the people so that they could protect themselves from central banks and printing, et cetera. And I find that while maybe when 2009 to 2012 period, there was a lot of this, influence in the silver industry as well, that it was a type of money, that it was an alternative to the US dollar, not just an investment. I find less of that today. Can you speak to the Constitution, the bimetallic standard, and how we've gotten so far away from that? And also like the prospects for even perhaps moving back. I think there's certain towns throughout the country where perhaps if you walked into small stores with silver, that more people than we might expect would accept that silver for their goods and services. So perhaps there's something to be said for at a local level, there an ability to maybe even start increasing the velocity of silver in terms of buying and selling goods. But any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, I think the founding fathers knew that gold and silver was a check on the ability of a government to just print money at will and damage financial systems, take control of financial systems, because those who control the money control the political class, because they basically buy them off or, contribute to their campaigns, and they influence the political class and therefore the laws that are made. And so gold and silver are money per the Constitution. Nothing else can be used to pay in payment of debts. The fiat system came about, if you read The Creature from Jekyll Island from J. Edgar Griffith, but also if you read some Austrian economists' books around how the Federal Reserve was created, it's well documented. It was done at a time in which people went home for Christmas. Congress left for Christmas, and think we didn't have TV and internet back then. So they went home, and a group of small people went and passed this bill to create the Federal Reserve. And that's the only way they could do it, because we had been fighting the central bank since the time of Andrew Jackson and didn't want one. And the only way they were going to get it in was to get a minority in Congress to approve it. And that's exactly what happened. So we get the Federal Reserve. And this system was designed to create paper dollars in which we basically pay interest on the creation of our own money to an outside party of private bankers who own the stock of the Federal Reserve. And a long story short, about 20 years after that, they have the gold confiscation, which was executive order, which is a violation of the separation power clause in the Constitution. So what you'll notice is our transition from gold to silver had to be done unconstitutionally through the corruption of our legislative and executive branches. Once that was done through the executive and legislative branches, then you had gold removed as money. And so you couldn't own gold for a long time. And then in 1971, Nixon took us off the gold standard. So there's no gold backing of the dollar. The reason is because European nations were trading our increasingly worthless dollars for our gold and robbing robbing our treasury of the gold. And so Nixon had to stop it because it would have collapsed the dollar right there and then. So he took us off the gold standard. We went pure fiat. Well, in the 50 years of pure fiat, what have we had? Major financial crises over and over again, massive money printing. 40% of all M1 money supply ever created since 1913 was done last year during the pandemic. So now we're having massive inflation. Now we have massive debt issues. We had more debt and deficits in government we've ever had. So the system's run out of control. It's not the design of the founding fathers. And so now you talk about, should precious metals be back in the monetary system? I think so. I own it because I believe it's money. It's not that I'm necessarily speculating on getting rich, but I understand that it's going to hold value better over time than any other asset. And I'm including real estate, with the exception of farmland. Farmland's the only exception, but any other real estate, any other paper assets, stocks, bonds, so on and so forth. And yes, gold and silver should be money. I do think that there's an underlying current of activism, like you said, and you saw at the Bitcoin conference, for people to develop alternatives. I would argue that gold and silver is already there. It's the natural alternative. But others like Bitcoin as well. And I recently went to Market Disruptors in Miami, and I talked to Stephen Libera and Bitblock Boom, the gentleman that runs that conference. And we had an interesting discussion about Bitcoin, and they believe that Bitcoin is the alternative in the modern day and age to the fiat system. They have no problem with gold and silver, but they believe you need some sort of decentralized, people-run currency. And there are a lot of people who believe that. And when Bitcoin came about, regardless of who Satoshi is, and a lot of people believe different things. I don't believe it's one person. I think it was a collection of people, because the system is so complex. One person could not have coded that, just my opinion. Anyway, when you talk about who supports Bitcoin, it's sound money advocates, it's Austrians, it's libertarians, it's crypto punks, or cyberpunks. It's everybody that doesn't trust the federal government or has been burned by the federal government and their current system. And that's what Bitcoin, gold, silver have in common. It's the same movement. It's just different collections of people coming together. And with the proliferation of now like 10,000 coins, different coins based upon the blockchain concept, what you have is people basically saying, we want our own stores of value. And this has happened 10,000 times over. And that entire movement of the blockchain and the cryptocurrency, the private cryptocurrencies, is basically saying, hey, look, we don't like your system. And we've created what we think are systems that you can't control and you can't stop. And it's going to be very hard to legislate against. I think the federal government is going to come back and try to legislate against it. But that's what's going on right now. It's the people standing up to their government and saying, we're tired of this system.
Gold versus Bitcoin. Why do you prefer precious metals to Bitcoin? And let's leave it at that.
So I am not the world's biggest Bitcoin proponent for several reasons. I'll say this: gold and silver are nature's money, and the major problem is not that they couldn't be used as money. Once again, they could be. I mean, you could do gold and silver backed by real bills of credit or something like that. It's very easy to run a system off of gold and silver, even if you're using paper remittances, or you can computerize it. We've got the infrastructure right now to computerize gold and silver. You see Kinesis and Load and all that technology using the blockchain is there. So you can use the blockchain gold and silver and have, the perfect currency. And I think the only problem with it is the people allow their governments to convince them that gold and silver don't hold value over time and that they need something else. And it's really what stands in the way of gold and silver being the ultimate money is the people listening to the financial types saying you need something better through artificial crises. In terms of Bitcoin, you know, technically, I'm a technical guy. I have 3 degrees in computer science, a master's in cybersecurity. So my background was in technology for 25 years. I look at Bitcoin and say it's a great idea. Right now, you can't have it be a world reserve currency. There are too many technical issues. Now, could Bitcoin 2 and 3 and 4.0 eventually get there? Sure. You've got different types. You've got Bitcoin SV, which is a little bit faster. You know, you've got your proponents of each. At the end of the day, the point is not whether it's Bitcoin or Litecoin or Hashgraph or Bitcoin 2.0 or whatever the case may be. The point is that there is a system out there which allows people to vote on the state money and say, we are voting you out. And that's the importance of Bitcoin to me. Will it become the true alternative currency? I don't know at this point. I don't think anybody knows. We're only 10 to 12 years into this experiment, right? We don't have the thousands of years of history we have with other monetary systems. So nobody really knows. But at the end of the day, the important point is Bitcoin is here as a testament that the old system, the central bank model, doesn't work, and we don't want it. We want some sort of decentralized system. Whatever that ends up being, you know, Bitcoin, gold, silver, something else, that's representative of the people's voice. And to me, that's the importance of Bitcoin.
At the founding of this nation, there were many different types of, I think, state-based currencies that were being issued. There was like the New York dollar and some other versions thereof. Do you think that might be a path forward for certain states to maybe create their own state-based or regional currency that's backed by gold and silver?
I think they will. Most of the state currencies failed because back then they either didn't back it with specie, gold and silver bullion, or they got into wars. There was a revolutionary war or civil war that destroyed those currencies. So the state-backed currencies can work, but again, what will happen is you may have 50 different ones. And the issue is, how do you trade, you know, how do you value one to another? You can talk about the complexity of trading the dollar against the euro and the pound, you know, and against the Chinese yuan. Talk about trading the Texas dollar versus the Louisiana, you know, whatever they call it. You know, it's going to be very complex for people. So yeah, we could get to state-based currency or state currencies, but it needs to have a common base. In other words, all the states need to get together and say, okay, how do we one, transact between the two? Is it going to be the blockchain? It'd be an ideal solution. Use the blockchain, right? And use smart contracts and allow that to be automatically negotiated and systematically negotiated. But then what is it backed by? Because if you just issue any fiat currency, I don't care what it is, if there's not some sort of backing and or limitation on the creation of such currency, then you're going to have issues. So would they do their own digital cryptos? Perhaps. Could they do gold and silver? Perhaps. I mean, we don't know. But I do think that there's going to be incentive for states to do that, because if you look at what's happening with the states and the people, especially, the federal obligations are drowning the states and the people in tax payments and in debts and things like that. If the states want to run their budgets, balance their budgets, and have any fiscal independence, they're going to have to get into their own currency systems, however that manifests.
People who maybe aren't into gold at all quite yet, how would you recommend that they start getting into gold? Where do they start to learn about it? And where do you think they should perhaps start looking to maybe even purchase physical in particular?
Well, I think you should just research some basic Austrian economic texts. Look up Henry Hazlitt, look up von Mises, look up those guys. Go to Mises.org, MISES.org, and just educate yourself a little bit. Follow some of the influencers on YouTube. Do your own research. You know, I always tell people, do your own research. I'm not your financial advisor. You have to think for yourself. In fact, I just did a video on this yesterday. You have to think for yourself. So you have to do for yourself, but do research before you buy anything. The easiest way to get in is just to buy regular common bullion coins, American Silver Eagles, Canadian Maple Leafs, things like that, things that fit your budget, that are relatively low premium retail items. I can always recommend outlets to go to. We have relationships with many, but just search for price, do your due diligence there. Eventually you can get in things like numismatic collectibles if you want, but you want to start off with the basic coins, basic 1 ounce coins and bars. I will say this, Silver is more speculative because it's used so much as a commodity that its price is much more volatile. So if you're a little bit more of a gambler, silver is probably your game. If you're more of, I just want to buy and hold it for 30 years and maintain my value compared to inflation and devaluation of the dollar, I would say go into gold. But honestly, you probably want to do a little bit of each, because I think silver's upside is very attractive for people. They're going to want to try to recover from the robbing of their wealth through the fiat system. So either one is probably a safe bet, but I would do, half and half mixes of both if it were me.
So silver is in the low 20s still, maybe like inching up towards the mid 20s. What's going on there? Don't you think it should be priced a little bit higher than $24?
Yeah, there are all sorts of ways to measure that. If I will say this, the Silver Institute and Metals Focus, which did this research in November of last year, predicted that we use 1 billion ounces of silver in industry and for investment across the world in 2021 for the first time in human history. And that seems to be coming true based upon the numbers we're seeing so far this year. So we're using more silver than ever. And so silver is hugely in demand. And the thing about silver is it's one of those metals that can't be destroyed, but it can be put into landfills, because when you put it into like a phone, like you take my iPhone, for example, it has a little bit. You buy a car, it has a little bit. You buy a computer, it has a little bit. There's some in military applications, medical applications, solar panels, electric vehicles. I mean, everything has silver, right? But it's done in relatively minute amounts. So the recovery of silver scrap is very low when compared with gold in terms of overall percentages. So most silver is sitting in landfills or is sitting in people's closets in terms of products, right? Or is sitting in products currently being used or being developed. And so what happens is, even though silver is more abundant than gold, it's actually physically less abundant in immediately gotten form. So silver is much more rare, even though it comes out of the earth at a pace of 15 to 1 to gold. It's much more rare in reality because of the way it's used as a commodity, much more than gold is. So most of the gold ever mined above ground, it's in collectors' hands, or it's being recycled and scrapped from computer motherboards. It's very lucrative business for people. Silver's not. So silver should be priced much higher. I actually wrote an article on Seeking Alpha in 2010, I believe. It was like the 6th article I ever wrote. And I predicted that silver one day a 1 ounce silver coin would trade the same as gold, and people thought I was nuts. But if you just look at how silver is used and how rare it really is, and I'm not talking about in the Earth's crust, but I'm talking about you can actually get your hands on it, and the immense value it has to industry, as well as a monetary, has been money for 6,000 years. To me, it has immense value, but the derivatives markets are treating it like an easily gotten, easily tradable commodity. And that will only change when there's a mass physical supply shortage to industry. When Samsung and Apple can't get their silver, when Tesla can't get their silver, you will see that price spike. And I think that's coming sooner rather than later, because we're starting to hear companies go straight to the mines and buy it right off the mines.
At Silver Symposium, there was Lewis James of the Independent Speculator, I believe, and he was discussing that there was a possibility that, in his views, silver had been demonetized. I've actually heard this from a couple different people, that silver had been effectively demonetized. What are your thoughts on something like that?
I basically said the same thing in a presentation I gave last week at the OTC, which is our over-the-counter stock markets here in the US. I was a keynote speaker at a conference last Thursday. And I said the same thing. I think the long-term plans for gold is to capitalize the commercial and central banking system. It's why they're hoarding it and discouraging people from having it. They want it all, because whenever this financial reset comes, gold is going to be one of the foundational pieces to recapitalize that commercial banking system and that central banking system. Silver is used in so much stuff. It's used in our technological age that if we try to remonetize it, you wouldn't have enough to run the cameras that we're recording on. You wouldn't have enough to do the space race. I mean, all of this, Bitcoin couldn't proliferate because computers would eventually break down. You wouldn't have enough silver, right? So we need silver to help run our modern technological society. And the powers that be cannot, the regulators, the governments can't allow silver to be monetized again. I do think silver is still going to be the poor person's gold. It's going to be money for the average individual, but you're going to have to get it now, because I'm telling you, it's getting more scarce. If you have silver in the future, you're going to have immense wealth. And I'm talking 5 to 10 to 15-year time frame as this reset progresses. And, we change over our financial system and the central bank digital currencies, all that stuff. Silver will become immensely valuable, much more than $25 an ounce. But you got to get it now because it's getting so tight. The inventories of silver are getting so tight. You don't have long to get it. And I do think it is being demonetized, but I think it's always going to be money to people that hold it because of its immense value.
And so perhaps this is less that silver is facing less demand as a monetary metal, but rather just facing increasing demand for its technology purposes.
For both, the investment demand is going up and technology demand, but technology demand is going to, in a few years, because of all the ESG programs and environmental programs around the world, industrial demand for silver is going to dwarf available supply, and you're not going to be able to buy it for investment. And I predict this probably within the next 3 to 4 years.
Looking back at Texas, what's the future hold for Texas on multiple fronts, but particularly as a financial powerhouse?
Well, the politics of Texas is always changing. We're kind of a purple state now, so there is a lot of both liberal and conservative. But the thing about Texas, having lived here for 46 years, the thing about Texas is we're fiercely independent. I don't care what part of the political spectrum you're from. Texans are Texans, right? The phrase or the slogan, "Don't mess with Texas," is still in effect. I think Texas eventually, whether or not it leaves the union, is going to become a lot more independent. And we have energy independence in terms of coal and oil and gas, and that will probably persist for some time. I think that Texas is going to want financial independence to some degree. It would not surprise me if Texas is the first to turn to either a gold-backed currency or its own like digital currency in the state before all the other states do. And it wouldn't surprise me if the government's basically, flip the bird to the federal government and start suing them on everything. They're suing them on vaccine mandates. They're suing them on all these other laws that are coming down from the recent administration. They're involved in a lot of lawsuits. So the state of Texas is going to be, it's the 800-pound gorilla. It has enough power to basically say, we don't even need to be a part of the union anymore. And the U.S. doesn't want that because Texas is one of those states that contributes more to the union than the union contributes to Texas. So that nobody wants to lose Texas. But Texas can basically, I think, has its own destiny in its hands. And it'll be interesting to see which direction the people take it.
How has it evolved since the pandemic, especially with migration? I think, as you mentioned, it's a purple state. What does that mean for Texas and for the U.S.?
Boy, migration has not stopped. COVID in Texas was scary for a little while if you believe that COVID was the Spanish flu. I never did, but mostly people stayed indoors for a while. And then after a while, it was like, last year, the Texas removed restrictions, 50% and then 100% of the restrictions. And then he issued an executive order, which basically said you can't issue a mask mandate in schools, public buildings, restaurants, so on and so forth. So we're basically where we were before. However, there have been changes like local movie theaters. Nobody goes anymore. That industry has not recovered anywhere in the state of Texas that I can tell. So there's still damage done. But in terms of immigration and business, we're doing very well. I would say we're in a bit of a property bubble real estate wise because so many people are moving here that real estate prices are getting bid up like nobody's business. And it's not just from Central and South America. We've got more transplants from California than any other state. People are fleeing California in droves, and the number one state they're coming to is Texas. They're also going to Florida. Okay, but Texas is number one. And it's funny that Florida people are coming to Texas too. And we have people from the East Coast coming to Texas and Boston. There have been so many transplants I've met recently coming to Texas. I've never seen it like this. So Texas population wise is growing steadily. Business is growing steadily. We're open for business. The government's made it known. The governor's made it known. The state legislature and the government and the governor are basically saying, we want to be free and independent and maintain an independence. And we want to be multicultural. The thing that people don't realize about Texas is, yes, we have a lot of immigration from Hispanic speaking countries, but we used to be owned by, the land used to be owned by Mexico and Spain. So we have a multicultural heritage. And a lot of the laws in Texas around property and community are Spanish laws. I did an interesting experiment. I went back to all the properties I own. I used to own rental properties and my home. And I went to the Texas land management office. Texas has its own land management office, different from the Bureau of Land Management. And I said, I want to see the original deeds for my properties in the state of Texas. And they said, fine, they're Spanish. I said, what do you mean? Well, when Texas won its independence, we took all the Spanish land grants and then just transferred them to the state of Texas. So all of our original land grants were done by Spanish authorities, and the state of Texas recognized them. So the state of Texas has always been very diverse. So the fact that we have this population increase from Spanish-speaking countries is nothing new. They've always been here. And I think that just adds to the appeal of Texas because, we're contrary to what you see in Hollywood, we're so much more diverse and multicultural than people realize. And it's the way it's always been, and that's been a strength of ours.
Now that you mentioned, I guess Texas is home to like some of the biggest media shows on the planet right now. Joe
Sure.
Rogan is
Yes.
based in Austin. And then, dare I say his name, Alex Jones, is, whether or not you like him or not, very big. He's very, very big. His Joe Rogan episodes are almost as big as the Elon Musk episodes. So therefore,
and Elon Musk is here now. Tesla moved their corporate headquarters to Austin. So there you go.
If you were in charge of a monetary policy in Texas, what would you do? And how does that fit in with some of what we talked about at the beginning of this, with Texas becoming a financial powerhouse and creating an environment for gold trade?
The first thing I do is take control of education, because education is where you're going to make the most impact. Education is messed up everywhere because the federal government provides money and dictates what you can have. And I know this because I went to my local school board in my local ISD, Independent School District. That's what we call them here in Texas. And they said that their curriculum is largely determined by federal authorities. So you have got to take back control of education. The great thing about Texas, you can homeschool. It's voluntary. They cannot force you into public schools. It's part of our law. And it would be extremely hard to change, because you have to go change the Constitution, which requires not only an amendment, but a referendum by the people. So Texas is always going to be a free state in that term. But the educational authorities have to assert themselves and say, we don't want Common Core and all this other garbage. We want to educate the way that we want. Because through education, you can teach people the history of money, and you can teach people the history of independence, and more so than the garbage curriculum that the federal authorities want, because the federal authorities don't want to emphasize individual rights or states' rights. So you got to take care of education first. The second thing you do is you expand that Boolean depository, and you say, hey, anybody that works in the state of Texas for any employer, instead of investing these 401ks, why don't you can put money into the Boolean depository, and we'll write favorable tax laws around that. That would be a positive move towards having financial independence. The third thing is Texas needs to assert itself in terms of money, because the United States government has decided to create dollars as currency. Texas come out and say, forget that. We're going to trade silver coins or copper coins or whatever the case may be. And they could offer a monetary alternative for payment of state debts. So that would allow people in Texas to have a functioning alternative monetary system. And with all the technology we have around the blockchain thing, it'd be very easy to implement this. Very, very easy. So that's what I would do. The last thing would be more favorable tax law. We don't really have income taxes in Texas, although we do have franchise taxes for business that you have to pay. They need to remove that tax burden. They need to remove some of the taxes off of businesses and let people not have to worry about business taxes so much, and balance their budget, with those less revenues. Because at the end of the day, what we don't want to happen is that Texas becomes a financial powerhouse and then becomes a replication of the federal government. We need to get back to constitutional rights, stop confiscating through taxes, offer sound money alternatives, allow the people to educate themselves, okay, and stop allowing the federal government to dictate that. Allow people to have the freedoms that were guaranteed to them in the Constitution. And then I think that you will see Texas stand up as its own entity and have its own currency and be strong and not depend upon the federal government. And by the way, this can happen to any of the other states.
You mentioned taxes, and I think one of the reasons that you cited for Texas's move towards perhaps being a gold trading hub was because of taxes being levied from New Jersey because of locations of data centers of the exchanges, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so NASDAQ and quote unquote other markets, which I'm guessing is going to be the New York Stock Exchange, are frustrated because the state of New Jersey, where a lot of the data centers are, where a lot of the transactions come into, wants to charge like a VAT tax or a per transaction tax of like 6 or 20 cents. I don't remember what it was in the article, on every financial transaction. Think of how many billions of financial transactions occur. So that was the state of New Jersey said, great, we estimate this is going to give us 10 billion in revenue. And the exchanges are like, no, because think about it. If all your algorithms are designed to trade and make pennies on every trade. And now those taxes take up those pennies. You basically rob the exchanges of the way that they make profit. Now, I don't feel sorry for the exchanges because, like I said, I think they're run by entities that are trying to use those exchanges to take money from the people and trade against the people's book. But at the end of the day, the right way to do that's not to tax, not for a state to levy a tax on that. That's not the right answer to that. The right answer is to have open competition, and I think that's what NASDAQ and the only reason NASDAQ did it was because of that potential tax, or at least that's what we're told. So I do think NASDAQ is right now in favor of competition, although they probably want to monopolize Texas as well. So what I would like to see happen is that multiple states open markets, even regionally, even if we have 4 to 5 ones, and offer true competition. Anytime you have a concentration of a market in one state or on one platform or in one vehicle, and you don't have competition, you're going to have collusive practices. So we really need not only Texas, but California, any other big state, basically say, we're open for business. We're going to create an alternative market. And honestly, that's the way the founding fathers intended it to be as well.
How is all of this in Texas a part of the Great Reset?
So I think the Great Reset is going to require new gold trading hubs. If you look not only at Texas and what's happening there, in Tennessee, potentially being an alternative gold storage facility for these markets. You look at Basel III, and Basel III appears to be, it's coming out of Europe, and it appears to be wanting to yank the gold trade out of London OTC market. London OTC is a granddaddy of them all when it comes to gold, but it's a heavy derivative market. It's where 1 ounce of gold may be traded 10,000 times in a day. And we don't even know what the true number is because there's no transparency on that market. You want to talk about lack of transparency in COMEX. There's zero transparency in London. They publish very little on what they publish, I do not believe, because they've constantly made data errors. So I don't even think they know what they have. And the way that is traded is very manual. It's just, it's a god-awful market. And I think that the collusive powers in London have had a stranglehold on gold for so long that everybody's realizing we need to get gold out of London. Now, it can be one of the trading hubs, but we want to emphasize others. So China's going to benefit from this. Texas would benefit from this. Europe would benefit from this. The Middle East would benefit from this. I think we're going to go to a regional model, which is not dominated by just the COMEX and the London OTC market. And I think that part of the Great Reset needs to happen because they need to implement a new system where gold has a new purpose. Gold's no longer the people's money, it's the capitalizing the new system. And on top of that, they're going to put a central bank digital currency. But how they're going to value each other against each other, all these global banking, central banking entities, is how much high quality liquid asset they have. And Basel III defines gold as a high quality liquid asset, just like cash in the system. And so I think that's what's happening. I think that's part of the Great Reset. There's many other parts of the Great Reset, but that's a big part of it.
For those who don't know, what is Basel III?
Basel III is a set of regulations that originally came about because of the mortgage crisis in 2008, 2009. I think it was first proposed in 2004. Well, it was first proposed in 2012. 2014 had the first regulations. For the last 7 years, they've been trying to comply. It's not just around gold, it's around solvency, the banking system, liquidity ratios, quality of assets, that type of thing. And they're trying to stabilize the banking system. I think, honestly, it's not nearly enough. But there are some positives that come out of it is that the banks are trying to get more liquid. Now, in the last 7 years, they haven't been able to comply with all parts of it because they're so overextended on this debt system. I don't think they ever will be. But I think Basel III is there to try to build confidence in the system until we have the financial reset and the new system is in place. And I think Basel III will be part of the foundation of the new system, even though the new system is going to have different moving parts than the current one. So I really think of Basel III as this transitionary thing to get us through the reset and to keep people from revolting on the banking system by saying we're doing all this stuff. And then when the system eventually erupts, which it will, I mean, it's a Ponzi system which mathematically has to explode. When it does, they're going to say, okay, great, now let's define the new system. But I do think that they'll use some of those Basel guidelines in the new system as well.
We've had the honor of sitting down today with Robert Kientz, founder of GoldSilverPros.com. He has a YouTube channel as well, Gold Silver Pros. Thank you so much, Robert, for joining us today.
Justin, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure's all ours. Thank you, everyone, for listening.